On May 21, 1983, at Jamestown Base, Ellen Wilson talks to her husband Larry on Earth, asking him to stop throwing her parties. She says she doesn't want a birthday party because she doesn't like being reminded that she's 40, but would be fine with a welcome home party. Ellen is about to hand over command of the base and enjoys having it to herself for the last time. Outside, astronauts are positioning their rover to watch the sunrise. They turn off their flashlights and sing Three Little Birds, joined by Ellen from the base. Margot Madison wakes up in her office and gets updates from her assistant Emma about work and her aunt's surgery. Margot learns there might be lithium near Jamestown and confirms the Soviets know about it. Later, Margot gives General Bradford Army Air Force game tickets, suggesting he allow a landing at Edwards and free up space at Vandenberg. He agrees to the landing, but not the Vandenberg launches. Margot continues her day while dealing with other issues and personnel. Meanwhile, Ed Baldwin plays golf in his office when Gary Piscotti nervously asks him for a crew slot on the Pathfinder mission. Ed finds his ambition amusing, but tells him to be patient. In Arkansas, Gordo Stevens gives a guest talk while drinking. He's asked about past missions and smiles, reflecting on how things often go wrong in space. Elsewhere, a solar flare hits, causing a communication blackout. On the moon, Ellen orders astronauts back to the base, but Molly Cobb and Wubbo Ockles are too far. They take shelter in a lava tube, but Wubbo's rover flips. Molly rescues him, risking heavy radiation exposure during the storm. Molly Cobb tells Ellen Wilson that she took shelter in the lava tube while trying to save Wubbo Ockles. Although they made it back to Jamestown, Molly wasn't feeling well. Ellen reassured her she made the right call. A doctor predicted Wubbo would likely develop cancer, and Ellen told Molly she'd be returning to Earth with her, despite Molly's complaints that her dosimeter read green. Ellen's decision was final. Later, Margot Madison video calls Ellen, asking about the power situation. Ellen updates her, saying the Mars program would be paused due to damaged fuel rods. Margot plans to send more plutonium and mentions following nuclear transport guidelines. However, General Bradford says they must consult the Pentagon first. Administrator Thomas Paine arrives with news that the president wants to ease tensions with the Soviets by arranging a handshake in space between an American astronaut and a Soviet cosmonaut. Margot laughs but is told to prepare. As Ellen prepares to leave Jamestown, she assigns Alex Rossi as the new commander. She boards the LSAM with Molly and others for the trip back to Earth. Meanwhile, Gordo Stevens plays video games, losing to Ed Baldwin. Danielle Poole is hesitant to get out of her car, and the group discusses life and changes at Outpost. Danielle expresses her desire to return to Jamestown, though Gordo and Ed aren't interested. Eventually, Ed agrees to start her paperwork. Tracy Stevens, now married to Sam Cleveland, continues her public appearances, while Gordo gives a talk at a Rotary Club. Tracy and Gordo's family gather for Danny's return from Annapolis, and Gordo awkwardly congratulates Tracy on her new marriage. Back on Earth, Molly isn't feeling well, and Wayne helps her slip away unnoticed. Ellen settles back into her role at NASA, discussing budgets and the Mars program delays with Margot and Thomas. Ed continues managing astronaut training, including welcoming new recruits. As Ed and Gordo reflect on their lives, Gordo opens up about feeling lost since his time on the moon. Meanwhile, Molly urges Wubbo to not give up, though he plans to return to the Netherlands to spend his remaining years with his family. A team of NASA astronauts on the moon finds their equipment moved and realizes the Soviets have taken over their mining site. Ed Baldwin tells General Bradford and Margot Madison that the Soviets must have cracked NASA's code. Administrator Thomas Paine says that President Reagan decided to reclaim the site rather than report it to the UN. Though Bradford is hesitant, Paine argues the Soviets cannot stay indefinitely. They discuss the need for constant monitoring, but Ellen Wilson warns that no astronaut is trained for military operations on the moon, though Marines might be sent. Meanwhile, Gordo Stevens struggles with his NASA suit due to weight gain, and Tracy Stevens is late for a simulator session, making excuses. At home, Karen Baldwin is surprised when her daughter Kelly expresses interest in applying to the Naval Academy. Karen is hesitant, but eventually supports Kelly's decision. Margot Madison visits Elida Rosales, who is about to be deported. Margot offers her a job at NASA to help, but Elida feels humiliated and later breaks up with her boyfriend Davey for calling Margot without her consent. Elida, conflicted, eventually agrees to take the job. At Jamestown, a bug is found in a light fixture, confirming Soviet espionage. This discovery shames Ed, as the bug may have been planted during his mission. Tracy visits Karen at the outpost and shares her frustration about public perception, while later having a late-night encounter with Gordo. She is conflicted about her new marriage and Gordo's return to the moon. Gordo reassures her, though tension remains. Ed, Karen, and Kelly reconcile after a heated argument about Kelly's decision to join the Navy, evoking memories of their late son, Shane. They sing a Navy song together as a moment of healing. Karen cancels their Bahamas trip, telling Ed he's heading back to space on Pathfinder *. Ed insists he's content on Earth, but Karen says he's clearly not. She points out his excitement during every launch and says things will be different since she's managing the outpost and won't be worrying about him as much. At NASA, Ed grins at his Pathfinder model. Gordo panics while suiting up in a spacesuit, feeling trapped in his helmet, but he tells everyone he's fine. Later, he drinks with Ed, Danny, and Danielle at the outpost, admitting his anxiety. Ed reveals he's taking command of Pathfinder, inspired by their recent performance. Danielle asks about Ed's replacement at the astronaut office. Ed visits Molly, asking her to run the astronaut office until her medical leave ends. She agrees, but says she still wants to fly. Danielle visits Ray, Clayton's sister, who accuses her of sacrificing her own reputation and that of all black astronauts for a white man. Ray gives her one of Clayton's medals, blaming Danielle's patriotic ideals for sending him to Vietnam. Ellen Wilson meets Thomas Paine about Mars exploration. He advises her to be politically strategic, but praises her authenticity. Ellen later finds a book from Pam Horton with a note asking if she recognizes the poem written about her. Gordo watches Tracy Stevens' launch on TV, but struggles to focus, eventually switching back to the broadcast. Ed later invites Gary Piscotti to join Pathfinder, while Danielle demands a command role, feeling sidelined. Ed defends his choices, but acknowledges her frustrations. During a flight with Gordo, Ed's jet catches fire, and he's forced to eject, parachuting into the ocean. Tracy Stevens lands on the moon and is amazed by the view. However, her astronaut partner wasn't recording, so they reenact the moment. Karen Baldwin wakes up late at night to a distressing call. She and Kelly discuss how hard it is to cope with such stress, but Karen struggles to find comfort. Another call confirms Ed is safe, though Karen still seems shaken. Ed arrives home, soaked from an incident, and apologizes. Karen, feeling off, leaves for work early. At Jamestown, Tracy is welcomed and given a Linus patch as the new crew member. She's shown around and feels a bit overwhelmed by the experience, especially after seeing an old photo of Gordo and Danielle with the warning, "Don't let this happen to you." In Margot Madison's office, Gordo and Ed face consequences for reckless behavior. Though they are reprimanded, Molly Cobb gives them a final chance. Thomas Paine and Margot feel Molly was too lenient, but Molly insists she handled it her way. Elida Rosales starts her new job at the Johnson Space Center and excitedly returns to a place filled with childhood memories. She joins the Apollo-Soyuz project, feeling proud. At Jamestown, Tracy learns her main job is transporting crews and supplies. Doug Price helps her with her shuttle controls, emphasizing that her role, though dangerous, is important. She struggles with sleep and stress, especially after a blocked vent causes a false toxic alarm. Meanwhile, Ellen Wilson reconnects with Pam Horton at a poetry reading, leading to them spending the night together. At Cape Kennedy, astronauts prepare for potential combat on the moon, though some are unsure when they would actually use their weapons. Molly reminds them of the rules of engagement. Back at Jamestown, Tracy becomes more isolated, struggling with exhaustion and homesickness. In contrast, Gordo prepares for his return to the moon by training rigorously and trying to confront his fears. Lastly, Karen bonds with Danny Stevens over memories of her late son, Shane. Later, Karen dances to Elvis's "Don't Be Cruel," reliving bittersweet moments from her past. A Soviet delegation arrives at NASA for a mission, and Margot Madison pretends to be happy, hoping the Soviets would do the same. During the meeting, a Soviet representative insists that the cosmonauts be called Cosmonaut 1 and 2, instead of being seen as secondary, and suggests naming the mission Soyuz Apollo. Discussions are tense, especially when they argue over the docking mechanism, with the Soviets wanting their Soyuz system to be the active part, frustrating the NASA team. On the moon, astronauts test guns, and Tracy Stevens teases Vance Paulson after he misses a target. Tracy later instructs a Marine on how to fly the lunar module, though he struggles. Margot is stressed by the difficult negotiations with the Soviets and asks Thomas Paine to send them away, but he insists that the mission must happen. The Baldwin family watches the news about the Sea Dragon launch, and their daughter Kelly asks why she was adopted, leading to a heartfelt family conversation. Danielle Poole bonds with the cosmonauts, taking them for burgers and drinks at the outpost. They share toasts and exchange pointed comments about each country's space disasters. Ellen Wilson walks with her partner Pam Horton, trying to figure out their relationship, but Pam is hesitant to trust her due to Ellen's public figure status. Later, Margot and the Soviet representative Sergei secretly meet and brainstorm a solution to the docking problem. They come up with an idea using bar coasters, which excites them both. The next day, Margot and Aleida Rosales present a new docking system to NASA and the Soviets, who agree that it will work. In New York, Ellen Wilson and Thomas Paine have a drink before discussing a space alliance with Korea. Thomas jokes about the Koreans being party animals, but their conversation is interrupted by a call telling Ellen that her father had a heart attack. Thomas insists she take the limo to see him, and he heads to the airport alone. On the plane, Thomas talks with Margot Madison about Ellen's father. They discuss the astronauts training in Russia. Suddenly, a jet shoots down their plane, and Margot loses connection with Thomas. Ellen visits her father in the hospital. He suggests she should help him with his company, but she reveals she's considering leaving NASA to pursue private space travel. Their conversation is cut short when Ellen learns that Thomas's flight was shot down by the Soviets. At NASA, Ellen takes over as acting administrator and discusses contacting astronauts Poole and Morrison, still in Russia. There's debate over the Soviets' attack on the plane, with Nelson Bradford mentioning spy planes over Sakhalin, which might have made the Soviets paranoid. Meanwhile, Danielle Poole is locked in her room in Russia, while Margot meets Sergei, a Soviet official, to discuss the astronauts' safety. They bond over a meal, and Sergei offers to help. At home, Ellen is exhausted. Pam Horton visits her, and they share a tender moment before Ellen receives a call from President Reagan, who offers support and asks her to pray. As tensions escalate, Bradford informs Margot that the Soviets may arm their Buran shuttle. Despite Margot's concerns, Bradford refuses to share vital information to warn the Soviets. The Moon Marines, Ellen Wilson, Margot Madison, and General Nelson Bradford report their mission success to the president. Margot inquires about Apollo-Soyuz, and Ellen emphasizes maintaining their moral high ground. The president praises Ellen's work, nominating her as NASA's permanent administrator, which she is encouraged to consider. They celebrate the possibility of going to Mars, while Bradford notes the Soviets likely delayed the Buran shuttle for repairs. Margot asks her assistant, Emma, to contact Sergei Nikolov to expedite plans. At Kennedy Space Center, Gordo Stevens and his crew nervously prepare for launch. Gordo meets Edward Baldwin, who expresses pride in him before he launches. Molly Cobb learns from her doctor that she has normal tension glaucoma, which could lead to blindness. Despite this, she tests a jet, pushing it to high speeds. Bradford and Margot inform Ed, Sally Ride, and Gary Piscotti that Pathfinder is now a joint NASA and Department of Defense mission. They discuss missile exercises intended for self-defense. Ellen shares her hesitation about accepting the NASA administrator role with Pam Horton, preferring to focus on her personal life. Gordo arrives on the moon, enjoying the lunar regolith before being welcomed back to Jamestown. At Outpost, Karen Baldwin and Danny Stevens share an intimate moment but agree their relationship can't progress further. Tracy pilots the LSAM, landing with Marines on the moon, where they encounter Soviet cosmonauts. Tensions escalate into a confrontation after communication fails, leading to a deadly encounter. Paramedics rush to help the injured cosmonaut as Commander Alex Rossi communicates with Houston. The Moon Marines inform him they sensed hostility from the cosmonauts, but they were only reaching for translation cards. Ellen Wilson demands confirmation that no weapons were visible before reporting the incident to the president. Ellen discusses the situation with General Bradford and Margot Madison, who notes that wars have ignited over less. Gordo Stevens checks on his ex-wife Tracy, who reveals her trembling hand, and he reassures her to give it time. On the news, they see the Soviet Union dismissing intimidation, claiming the US plans to deploy nuclear weapons on the moon. Concern grows when they learn that the armed Buran shuttle could attack from orbit. Tracking the shuttle, they find it has docked with Mir, leading Margot to believe they may be overreacting, but Bradford warns of fuel stockpiling. Suddenly, Buran launches, increasing pressure on the Sea Dragon's 17 mission. Ed Baldwin jokes with Molly Cobb about her glasses while briefing Gary Piscotti and Sally Ride on the mission, stressing the need for defense. Meanwhile, Rossi gets a message from the Zvezda commander requesting help for the injured cosmonaut. In Jamestown, Colonel Tsukhanov arrives with Dr. Mayakovsky to assess Roland Baranov, who accuses the Americans of aggression. While Ed reflects on his troubled conversation with Karen, Sea Dragon 17 successfully launches, but Baranov reveals his intentions to defect. As tensions escalate, Molly returns home to find Wayne packing. They share a brief moment before he leaves. In Jamestown, chaos erupts when an armed cosmonaut aims at the control room, causing Gatos to be thrown into space. In Mission Control, Bill Strausser and Elida Rosales supervise Apollo-Soyuz when Frank Sedgwick informs Flight Director Irene Hendricks that Jamestown is depressurizing and attempts to reach them fail. Margot Madison learns of this, and Alex Rossi reports issues with their sensors, noting that pressure has returned to normal. At Jamestown, Soviet cosmonauts hold Alex Rossi captive while all doors remain locked. Viktor Tsukhanov asks for Roland Baranov, but Rossi is unaware of his whereabouts and is punched for his ignorance. Ed Baldwin aboard Pathfinder thinks of his wife, Karen, as Gary Piscotti urges him to sleep. They are 2 hours from a potential confrontation with Buran, which Gary worries about. Ellen Wilson arrives at Mission Control, where Margot updates her on the Soviets requesting more time before docking, which Molly Cobb links to the lunar blockade. Margot, frustrated by the classified nature of Buran, insists they need transparency for informed decisions. Gordo Stevens and Tracy realize their room has been depressurized, and Gordo deduces the Soviets have infiltrated the base. He instructs Tracy to hide as Rossi relays that he's being held by the Soviets, who demand an exchange for Roland Baranov. At Jamestown, the Moon Marines gear up for action. Gordo and Tracy manage to contact Mission Control, but learn that communications are down, and Margot reveals they have 45 minutes before a nuclear meltdown occurs, threatening the base. Gordo volunteers to reach critical cables, and with protective measures, Tracy insists on accompanying him. As tensions rise, Karen and her daughter, Kelly, watch the news, learning of a nuclear threat from the Soviet fleet. Meanwhile, Ed's team faces a critical decision about engaging Buran, leading to a standoff between Ed and Sally Ride. Ultimately, the Apollo-Soyuz mission succeeds with a handshake, but Gordo and Tracy succumb to injuries in the chaos. The US holds a funeral for the fallen heroes, with Reagan honoring their sacrifice. Margot receives a call from Sergei, expressing condolences and discussing future meetings, unaware of the deeper political ramifications of their missions. Then, there's a glimpse of Mars in 1995, hinting at future explorations.